Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Cape Cod Maritime Museum's Winter 2023 Lecture Series, although a day like today feels much more like spring, so welcome to our Spring Lecture Series. We're very happy to have you with us today. I am Elizabeth York. I am the museum's Executive Director. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Mid-Cape Cultural Council and Mass Cultural Council, as well as our 2023 corporate sponsors, that is Cape Air, Highline Cruises, and Avangrid. And a big thank you for their generous support of the museum throughout the years. And it's really important to note that programs like this are made possible by the support from folks like yourselves watching here today. I really urge you to consider donating or becoming a member. Your support has really helped us host programs just like these. And so your support really helps us make sure that these programs keep going. So before we get started, just a few reminders about our Zoom lecture format. Please be sure to keep your microphone on mute and your video off so that all of the attention can be on our speaker today. If you run into any technical issues, please don't hesitate to send me a message via the chat function. Also, if you have a question for our speaker today, we will be taking those questions in the Q&A option, which is down on the bottom part of your toolbar in Zoom. We will also be taking questions in chat, but I would prefer if everyone can use the Q&A just so we can keep track of the questions after in our recording. So without further ado, today's lecture is presented by our very own curator, Emily Sullivan. So Emily joined Cape Cod Maritime Museum as the curator in February of 2022. Emily has a Bachelor's of Arts from Boston University in history. She also has a Master of Arts from American University in public history. She has served as the historian at the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, as well as at History Associates, Inc. of Rockville, Maryland. Now, Emily, if you want to unmute yourself, you are coming to us from my office right now, but you're at the museum today, and I am at home.
Yes. We just adopted a new cat and we figured it would be easier to be here instead of having him clawing at the door the entire time we're doing our presentation. So live from the museum.
All right. So why don't you take it away, Emily? Tell us all about the role of women in World War II and tell us all about the military history of that as well.
All right. So just a little bit of background about what kind of inspired this lecture. I've always been interested in World War, well, I've always is maybe an exaggeration, but not from birth, but for a very long time, I've been very interested in World War II history. I'm very much sort of a kid, growing up with like Band of Brothers, American Girl. D-Day had a really big anniversary while I was in 8th grade, and that really hooked me. And so I'm always excited to have an opportunity to talk about, this period and the various people that contributed to, all aspects of America's participation in the war. But this presentation in particular is really the product of some research we've been doing here at the museum for two upcoming exhibits. One, 2 years out, we're hoping to do an exhibit about for the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, talking about the Cape's participation in the war, what it was like on Cape during the war, all that sort of stuff from all angles. But in more recent, another exhibit we're working on is an exhibit all about the different contributions women have played in the Cape's history. This is an exhibit that's opening in October of 2023. It's going to cover women in all different realms: whaling women, women in business, women in science, women in art, and women in the military. So while doing a lot of research for that upcoming exhibit, we kind of identified this as a really cool lecture topic, as both, something we really want people to learn about, because it's something that has been really, sort of under discussed in the Cape's history, but also, a cool preview of what we're hoping is going to be a really, really cool exhibit. So hope to see you all back in October when that is open. But until then, to whet your appetite, I've got this presentation about the Cape's military women during World War II. But before we get there, I thought it would maybe be helpful for a lot of folks in the audience to kind of dial back a few decades and talk about sort of the early history of women in the military, so we can really kind of understand the context of why World War II was such a milestone for women who wanted to serve their country. So before World War II, just in general, women had extremely limited options if they wanted to serve their country in the military. I say extremely limited and not no, because while it would be a really long fight to be welcomed to the table by the armed forces as an equal participant, women still filled crucial roles for the American military during all decades of our country's early history. Beginning, right back to the American Revolution, when many army wives would follow their husbands into, not necessarily into battle on the battlefield, but, away from home with the army, and acted as laundresses, cooks, and performing other traditionally feminine tasks to really aid the military in this period. The U.S. Army in its initial iteration as the Continental Army was not the formalized structure that we have today. So you really did kind of, you didn't have a trained staff of cooks or laundry staff that could handle all of that stuff. So these women really played a very vital and important part. But in addition to that, a select few women found other more direct ways to aid the war effort. The most famous example of this is Massachusetts' own Deborah Sampson. She's pictured here on the left, one of my personal heroes from childhood. She was a young woman from Plimpton who disguised herself as a man to fight with the Continental Army. After an earlier failed attempt to enlist under the identity of Timothy Thayer, she successfully joined the Light Infantry Company of the 4th Massachusetts Regiment under the name Robert Shurtleff. Light infantry companies were elite troops. They were specifically chosen for being taller and stronger than the average person to help provide really crucial support during rapid flank coverage for advancing regiments, as well as rear guard and forward recon duties. This might sound a little strange for, why would, you'd think sort of stereotypically a woman might not be able to, physically meet those needs the way that a man would, or she would seem a little bit like, hey, you're not quite the person we would expect to be working in this role. But Sampson was reportedly 5'7", which was pretty tall for the 1780s, even for men. And she had worked in various capacities as an indentured servant. So she was really, very used to hard physical labor and was very physically capable and, good at doing this hard work, compared to, say, a wealthy socialite from Boston who decided to, just disguise her identity and fight with the army. As Robert Shurtleff, she fought with the army for 17 months before her identity was discovered. She was involved in several firefights, personally led raids, and was even wounded more than once without being found out. The first time, she took 2 musket balls to the thigh and a large forehead gash from a saber across her forehead, but managed to escape from medical care after only having her forehead wound treated professionally. She was able to dig out one of the musket balls herself, but the second one remained in her thigh for the rest of her life. Her identity was only discovered after she was being treated for fever in 1783. This is pretty common, actually, of a lot of women who, managed to successfully hide their identity. Their identity was often discovered when they were only sort of physically incapable of hiding themselves. So, being incapacitated by fever, your friends say, we need to take her to the doctor, and this is when the reveal happens. But, perhaps surprisingly for some of our listeners, instead of being reprimanded at all, she received an honorable discharge and later married, lived on a farm with her husband and kids. And when the family kind of ran into some financial hardships, they realized, hey, I'm a veteran of the U.S. Army the same way that, our male neighbors are and stuff. So she successfully lobbied to receive back pay and later a military pension. Later in life, she also gave lectures in full uniform about her time in service. And after her death, her husband successfully petitioned to receive spousal benefits of a veteran, which is incredibly unusual for the time. Unfortunately for him, he died before he could receive them, but this was like a really, it's really the first time this has really happened in U.S. history. This is a trend of women disguising their gender to fight in, military conflict that continued into the Civil War. Our second portrait here is of a woman from Minnesota who disguised her identity to fight with the Union Army during the war. Unfortunately for us historians, we don't know the true number of women who may have fought in disguise. Many of them, as I said, were only discovered after being wounded or getting sick, or in the case of Sally St. Clair during the American Revolution, after their death on the battlefield. So it's definitely possible that there were other examples of women who successfully concealed their identity and just never revealed it after they left the service. Recent scholars have estimated conservatively that there were about 400 to 700 individuals who disguised their identity to fight on both sides of the Civil War. So pretty large numbers. I feel like a lot of times when people talk about this, you hear about Deborah Sampson, you hear about maybe 1 or 2 from the Civil War, but you don't realize, no, this was like, women have always wanted to serve their country in, more active ways. Still in the Civil War period, other women on both sides of the conflict aided the war effort by acting as spies. Other women would also volunteer their time as nurses and medical professionals. This is another way in which women have always sort of historically played a role in military operations, because nursing is always a profession that has skewed towards women. Early nurses who aided the Army were civilians, and in some cases were basically just donating their time to field hospitals versus expecting any kind of compensation or benefits for providing the service. Clara Barton, pictured here, another Massachusetts native, by the way, helped formalize another way women could help their men in uniform with the founding of the American Red Cross. Post-Civil War, the military began to recognize the need for professional nursing forces to help support military doctors and hospitals. In 1898, soon after the end of the Spanish-American War, the military hired over 1,500 contract nurses to help care for sick and injured servicemen. The following year, the Surgeon General established criteria for a reserve group of nurses in anticipation of the next war. From there, the Army Nurse Corps was established in 1901, and the Navy Nurse Corps followed 7 years later in 1908. But these women still existed in this sort of weird half-in, half-out situation, where in many cases, they're still treated as civilians, even though they are officially employed by the Navy or the Army. In 1920, American nurses received the relative rank of officer, but they wouldn't receive permanent military commissions until 1947. And just in case there are any World War II buffs who know a lot about the sort of situation of nurses in this period or listening and think that I forgot, note that this is permanent military commissions. In February of 1944, Congress passed a bill that granted Army and Navy nurses actual military rank approved for the duration of the war plus 6 months. So that was kind of almost a test pilot program, like, hey, we really probably should do that for the purposes of the war. And then a few years later, like, we should make this a permanent deal. This is also actually why one of my sort of areas of expertise is the POW experience in the Pacific Theater. This is why the military nurses who were taken prisoner when the Philippines fell to the Japanese were interned with civilians instead of the Army, because they were not actually military personnel in the same way that they would be if a similar situation happened today. Which, knock on wood, hopefully not. With the exception of nursing, women in this period, post-Civil War, had essentially no options for other forms of military service. Women couldn't even serve while hiding their gender anymore, as new mandatory medical exams made it impossible to conceal physical sex. So this brings us up to World War I. I feel like with some of the recent attention World War I got because of the centennial, a lot of Americans are kind of surprised to find out that this was not a major mobilization time for women in the military. And I just want to remind everybody it's partially because we were only actually involved in the conflict for 18 months. Had we been in for the duration, it's possible that we would have seen more mobilization, but this is sort of really like incremental steps that ultimately leads to World War II. Still important though, so we're going to talk about it briefly. World War I marked the first time a woman could enlist as herself in certain branches of the armed forces. The first of these was Loretta Walsh, pictured here with her hand up, who enlisted as a sailor in the U.S. Naval Reserve on March 17th, 1917, and then became the first female petty officer when she was sworn in as chief yeoman on March 21st, 1917. About 13,500 women were admitted into active duty in the U.S. Navy during the war, filling stateside positions with the same benefits and responsibilities as men. So again, we're only in the war for 18 months, but 13K is a pretty significant number of women who jumped up to have to serve their country in this way. The Marine Corps enlisted 305 Marine reservists who were women, and a handful of women joined the Coast Guard, all of whom served at the Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. I say a handful because it's literally like 12 women, but the Marines are the three ladies pictured in the middle. And then, interestingly, the Army didn't adopt identical initiatives to have women fill stateside positions or otherwise really act in the military anyway at this period. But Hello Girls, American female switchboard operators, more formally known as the Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit, was formed in 1917 to help address communications issues on the Western Front. So this, the third photo on this slide is women at their switchboard stations. Applicants were required to be fluent in English and French, and of the 7,000 women who applied for these jobs, only 450 were accepted, many of whom had already worked as switchboard operators or worked at telecommunications companies. So really it was less an opportunity of like, I, Emily, who just wants to go and serve my country or have this unique experience, I would not really be considered as a serious applicant because they were really looking for skilled labor versus just, bodies to fill seats. These women, despite being issued Army uniforms and being held subject to the same Army regulations they would if they were men, were still considered civilian employees who were just employed by the military, and they wouldn't receive veteran status until 1978, which is a theme we're going to see further in this lecture. After the war's end, all of the women in these new support roles were demobilized, so the military was once again entirely male except for the Navy and Army Nurse Corps. By World War II, when, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the federal government realizes pretty quickly, we're really going to need to mobilize the entire population to help fight this war. And that's civilians working in factories, kids raising scrap metal for, shipping off to use as airplanes and all sorts of stuff. And this includes women helping, again, to fill in these support roles. By accepting women into these support roles, what you're essentially doing is freeing up men to go overseas in combat positions or other, even if they're going to still be working in a support role, it's a little bit, it's the 1940s, different time thinking about gender roles and stuff like that. It's seen as more acceptable to send a man off to duty in the South Pacific, even if he's not actively going to be firing a gun, than shipping one of your daughters off. So this sort of solves this problem of, well, how are we going to keep these stateside positions manned and operating? Taking inspiration from similar successful efforts already employed by the British during the war, the military quickly began putting together women's programs to help fit this need. And so eventually the American women had options to serve in all branches of the armed forces. So let's say that you're a woman who's thinking, what would I like to do to help my country as a military employee? You can join the Army Nurse Corps. Again, this is the oldest established organization that allows you to serve in this role. A lot of the requirements through these different branches are pretty similar. You're essentially looking for women who are between the ages of 20 and 40 with a couple, 28, 45, you kind of move it around that way. Nurses in particular, when they first were recruited, were supposed to be unmarried, but this was relaxed, fairly shortly after America's entry into the war, allowing women who were married to serve. You needed to be a high school graduate and a graduate of a 3-year nursing program and have a license in at least one state. You needed to be a US citizen, and you needed to be between 5 foot and 6 foot tall and have a physician's certificate of health and a letter testifying to moral and professional excellence. There are very similar requirements for the Navy Nurse Corps. The ages are a little bit different, as I said, but it's the same thing of initially they don't want married women. They relax that very shortly thereafter. You need to be professionally certified as a nurse. Some rando can't just wander in off the street, and the Navy isn't interested in wasting time training you to be a nurse. You need to come in with that experience. And you need to, meet the height requirements and the physical capabilities of the job. The first new organization that was founded was the WAC, which is the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which was later shortened to the Women's Army Corps. This was originally formed in May of 1942 as an auxiliary unit, but was converted to active duty in July of 1943. Again, you see this has similar requirements to the nursing program. But interestingly, the WAC was one of the few women's branches that was actually, I hesitate to say that it was really progressive because you still had to deal with racism and segregation within units. But from the beginning, they actively allowed Black, Latina, Asian American, and Native women to, apply and serve with the group. WACs were also unusual in that they served in all theaters of the war. Many of the other women's positions were only stateside, or sort of limitations of where you could go outside of the continental United States. But a WAC was not storming the beaches of Iwo Jima on the landing day, but they were in the South Pacific, they were in Europe, actively doing work. So if you're looking for that kind of experience, the WAC is the option you maybe want to go with. The next organization was the WAVs. This stands for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, but is actually the US Navy's Women's Reserve. This was established in July of 1942. Again, you have the same kind of requirements. You got to be a US citizen between the ages of 20 to 36 if you're an enlisted member, or between 20 and 49 for officers. You need to have 2 years of business or high school, or a college degree, or a mixture of college and work experience if you're planning to be an officer. Married women were allowed to enlist and were accepted for roles as long as their husband was not in the Navy, so it's not, a conflict of interest. WAVs couldn't marry during training, but afterwards there were no marriage restrictions. You could marry pretty much whoever you wanted as long as it wasn't crossing the officer enlisted line. They also didn't want to accept women who were mothers to children under the age of 18. Unlike the Women's Army Corps, Black women were intentionally not recruited until 1944, and we'll get into more of that in a little bit. And then in 44, you also had some WAVs who were allowed to be stationed in Alaska and Hawaii, in addition to continental United States positions. Next were the SPARs. This is the United States Coast Guard Women's Reserve. The name comes from the Coast Guard's motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. It was established in November of 1942. Again, pretty much identical requirements to the WAVs. And similarly, Black women were not recruited until 44, and you were stuck in the US until 44, when some were stationed in Alaska and Hawaii. The next organization is the United States Marine Corps' Women's Reserve. This was formed in July of 42, but was delayed until February of 43. Interestingly, it doesn't have a fun acronym like the other ones, because the head of the Marine Corps said these acronyms are silly, and if you're enlisting in the Marines, you're a Marine. It doesn't matter what you are. You're not a WAV, you're not a SPAR, you're a Marine. So that's why they don't have a easier to say acronym. But again, same kind of restrictions. U.S. citizen, not married to a Marine. Later, they did switch so that wives of enlisted men could join and enlisted women could marry after boot camp. They interestingly didn't start, partially because they started later than the other groups. You could be single or married when you first enlisted, but they kept the requirement of not having any underage children. This was one of the branches that intentionally did not accept Black or Asian American recruits for similar racist reasons as the Navy and the Coast Guard. And unlike their sisters in the Navy and the Coast Guard, some were allowed to briefly serve in Hawaii, but otherwise they all served in stateside positions. There are actually some cases where some Marine bases in California were basically 100% women ran later in the war, because all the men were in the Pacific. Finally, we have the WASP. The WASP is an interesting one compared to the others, because although they received the same military training as men, they were civilian employees. WASP stands for Women Air Force Service Pilots. We need to remember that this is a period before the US has their own independent Air Force. You have the Army Air Forces, which is part of the Army, and then you have Navy and Marine pilots, but there's no independent organization that only flies planes, essentially. These women were brought in to basically act as sort of an auxiliary help to the US Army, although they did also fly Navy and Marine planes. 25,000 women applied, and only 1,830 were eventually accepted. And of those, 1,074 actually completed training. So it was a pretty competitive program. This was definitely something where they wanted people who already had experience flying planes and, who could easily train to be put into military aircraft versus taking some random person off the street. Of these, of the people who completed training, 37 of them died in service. Another one vanished, and her body has never been recovered. So it's technically 38 who died in the service, but she's technically still listed as missing in action. Throughout the course of the period the WASP were active, they flew 77 different kinds of military aircraft, including some of the first jet aircraft produced in the United States. And this unit was, again, unusual compared to the others, because it was deactivated actually fairly far in advance of the war's end, because they sort of felt that the WASP had kind of achieved its goal. They didn't really need them to act as auxiliary anymore. Whereas pretty much everybody else we've discussed there, when you enlisted, you were enlisting for a period of the duration of the war plus 6 months, just so that there's some continuity when the war ends, and it's not, okay, everybody goes home, Germany's over, Japan has surrendered. So if you're still with me and think, hey, this sounds like a good opportunity, imagine you're a woman. Sorry, I just skipped ahead. But by the numbers, we've got about 305,000 or 50,000 women served in various branches during the course of the war. This is a pretty, impressive number for basically what amounts to only about 4 years worth of wartime service. And these women really basically okay, we're just gonna skip ahead. I'm sorry, my brain is like going in 5 different places. So imagine if you're still with me and want to serve your country. Imagine you're a woman between the ages of 20 and 45 and you decided you want to enlist. Well, why do you want to? There's a very good chance that you're considering it for the same reasons legions of young men have already decided to join. Patriotism, wanting to defend your country after the attack on Pearl Harbor and protect democratic and American ideas abroad and at home. This patriotism, inspired many women to, help the war effort in many ways. You have people who got factory jobs, people who volunteered for the Red Cross, but maybe for you, you think those are really useful and important positions, but I want to do something that's a little bit more active and different. This is one of the ways to do just that. Instead of just acting as a support role as a member of the Red Cross, you can serve alongside your brothers and friends in the Army and the Navy for, essentially the first time in history. Yeah, women did do this during World War I, but the numbers are significantly different. We had about 13,000 women in the Navy, but on the previous slide, we have over 300,000 women who serve their country. So, pretty huge difference in a fairly short amount of time. Another big selling point for you might be the actual jobs that are going to be opened up to you with these opportunities. While many of the jobs that were available to these women were the sort of things you could do as a civilian, like secretarial work, typing, stenography, other roles were totally unique and up to that point definitely considered men's work. Some women were actually really disappointed to be assigned a more typical job like working in an office. And some competition for some of the more attractive positions could be really fierce between you and your fellow WACs and WAVs. Women drove trucks, sent and decoded encrypted messages, became control tower operators at air stations, among many other roles. WAVs who became parachute riggers were expert seamstresses, and some even made jumps, although this was not a requirement to do the work. You can see a WAV who has just completed her jump up on the slide. Money and job security might also be a factor. The military provided a good salary, and for young women looking for steady work, many of whom were likely touched by economic hardship during the Depression, this was a pretty solid option if you're a young woman looking to find a way to support herself. Maybe you're adventurous and recognize that the military is an avenue to see parts of the country and the world that you might have never had the chance to visit otherwise. This is really an era where people are not necessarily traveling for recreational purposes the same way that we are today. So even though, as we've already discussed, your options for where you'd be posted would be a lot more limited than if you were a man, depending on which branch you enlisted with, women were still assigned to these posts all over the continental United States and later Alaska and Hawaii. So if you're from small town America and you've never really left, Idaho, Kentucky, wherever, or even, Boston, it's a chance for you to live in DC, San Diego, the deserts of New Mexico, or the coastal towns of Cape Cod. So pretty exciting opportunity. Finally, and this is more of an added benefit of enlisting versus, you've already made up your mind and this is just kind of a deciding factor of where do I want to go. It's not the sole reason why you would have said, oh, I really want to sign up for this job, but maybe you're drawn to the uniform. Military fashion was extremely in during the war. Civilian clothing brands mimicking WAC uniforms actually caused some major PR issues for the Army, which we'll kind of touch on in a little bit. And the Navy Department in particular really fully embraced this as a way to entice enlistees to pick the WAVs and the SPARs over other branches. They recognized that having a smart uniform not only attracted initial recruits, but it helped form a sense of identity and pride just as much as the training and eventual work would. The WAVs and the SPARs uniform was designed by Mainbacher, a well-known dress designer of the period. Some people insist that it is pronounced Mainbacher, or more French, but it is actually pronounced Mainbacher. Originally based in France, but born in Chicago, Mainbacher relocated to New York after the outbreak of World War II. The uniforms, some of which are up here on the screen, we've got both dress and more casual and summer uniforms, were designed to be really stylish, but also very practical and something the average woman could really take care of by herself without needing to have a maid to help her, get into it or launder it or anything like that, or a laundry staff who would have to wash all of their different clothing. You were expected to take care of your own uniform. Many women were drawn to this uniform because it was a rare opportunity to own designer clothes totally paid for by the US government, custom made for you. WAVs and SPARs interviewed after the war often mentioned their uniforms completely unprompted by interviewers, remembering them as some of the nicest pieces of clothing they'd ever owned. In 1943, the WAVs, along with other women in uniform, were named as Vogue's best dressed women in the world today. And as an aside, military fashion and one branch having a cooler uniform than the others is something that worked on men too. This is not purely this is just a universal thing for humans. I read a number of memoirs of guys who said part of the reasons why they joined the Marines versus, a different branch was because they loved, the look of the dress blues on the recruitment posters and thought, man, I'd look really snappy in that. So it crosses all bounds. So unfortunately, not everyone was happy to see women entering the military, even though they were coming in this very crucial and, difficult time in our country's history, even as non-combatants. There was genuine concern that this would cause women to abandon their traditional roles as wives and mothers and somehow usurp men. In 1943, a massive slander campaign against the WAC made recruitment numbers absolutely plummet, just total tailspin, out of control. Really freaked the Army and the government out. Stories started popping up all over the country about how women who enlisted were all secretly prostitutes or lesbians, or how entire battalions of WACs were sent home pregnant and riddled with STDs. Mind you, these stories are popping up before any battalions of WACs have even been sent overseas in the first place. It got bad enough that a formal investigation was launched, with the Army and the federal government genuinely thinking that this was an active attack on mobilizing American women by the Axis powers to damage the US's war effort, essentially. But unfortunately, it was discovered that the source of all of these rumors, all of which were provably false, were not the Axis. It was jealous American men, fear-mongering religious leaders, conservative journalists, and, most disappointingly, other women who resented the WAC for increased job competition, descending on their towns, sending men in stateside positions off to war, or because they felt their civilian agencies weren't getting as much attention in press as the women in uniform were. Once the Army had kind of put a stopper on this, they did a bit of a rebrand of the WAC. This is part of the reason it transitioned from an auxiliary unit to an active duty one, and really tried to sort of rebrand of, hey, no, your wives and daughters enlisting in this is not going to turn them into, a prostitute or anything. There are these very, virginal and pure women who are very patriotic and are here to do their duty. And eventually the tide kind of turns. But some of this prejudice still really hangs around even after the war is over. Women of color and queer women faced additional challenges. While the WAC and the Army Nurse Corps did allow Black women to enlist pretty much from the start, the other branches were much more reluctant to accept non-white women into the ranks. While the WAVES legislation that actually formed the organization did not have specific language barring Black women from joining, Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy, reportedly said that Black WAVES would happen, quote, over his dead body. And after his death in 1944, his successor was able to reverse this policy. But by then, recruitment efforts were really winding down. The war was really coming to an end at this point, and they realized we weren't going to need, tons and tons of more women to come in and serve these roles. So very few Black women actually served with the WAVES or the SPARs, and none were welcome in the Marines because the head of the Marines was still an incredible racist. We have 4 of these women who were ultimately to serve with the WAVES and the SPARs featured on this slide. I want to make it clear, though, that the Army was no angel race relations wise either in this period. Black WACs served in segregated units, and the Army Nurse Corps majorly limited how many Black nurses were accepted into their ranks. Black nurses were also generally only allowed to treat other Black patients or Axis POWs, not wounded white men. Similar discrimination happened in the WASP, even as a civilian but military organization. 2 Chinese American women, one of whom is pictured here, Hazel Ying Lee. 2 Latina women and 1 Native woman made it through training and flew as WASP, but multiple very qualified Black women were turned away after the final interview phase. At least one was told by Jackie Cochran, the really founder of the organization herself, that it was hard enough fighting for a woman's right to fly for the military without adding the battle for racial equality to it. All branches of the military likely had lesbians, bisexual women, or women who, if they lived today, might identify as gender nonconforming among their ranks, but as this was the 40s, most of these would not have been completely open with their sexuality or identity. But as no military organization really anticipated or seemed to think much of the possibility of gay women existing at all, women recruits didn't face the same pointed questions about their sexuality that their male counterparts did. In some cases, women who were more masculine presenting were actually specifically called out for being the sort of person you would want to actively recruit. Some Marine Corps examiners were quoted pointing out, quote, "It should be noted that women showing a masculine manner may be perfectly normal sexually and excellent military material." After the slander campaign against the WAC, part of which involved, hey, this organization is filled with lesbians, more measures were taken to try and limit the number of lesbians who joined up, but this wasn't exactly wildly effective. Despite the fact that they weren't really subjected to these sort of more initial barriers to enlisting, many of them really did find the Army a place, or other branches of the armed service, a place where they could sort of be themselves for the first time, meet other like-minded women, as long as they were careful. They still really needed to watch their back and protect their identities. Although the military treated lesbians as invisible during the recruitment and enlistment process, women could still be kicked out for being gay the same way a man could. And post-war, many of these women and their male counterparts really didn't share their stories or experiences until the 80s and 90s. And still, it's fairly uncommon to sort of find these experiences today. Sometimes because these people had already passed away by the time this conversation became more common. And some just because there's still some deep-seated, like, I don't feel like people want to know my story, I'm embarrassed, all that sort of stuff. So it's really kind of created this sort of silent history that we as historians have been trying to kind of unpack there. So if you're still with me and want to enlist and have made it past recruitment, training, all sorts of stuff, you might have been lucky enough to get stationed on Cape Cod. While Cape Cod isn't really necessarily often considered an exceptionally major player in the World War II history books, it was recognized like immediately and historically almost always as an important hub for military activity, and servicemen and women flooded our shores during the war years. I say the Cape isn't usually considered a major player in the war, and what I mean by that is that most of the work here done was important training and behind the scenes stuff. Is like, very important work, but I'm not about to reveal to you that, like, oh, we have our own Pearl Harbor here on Cape Cod that you've never heard of. One of the biggest contributions that the Cape provided to the war effort was the amphibious training done at Camp Edwards to prep for landings in both the Pacific and European theaters of the war. This includes a lot of preparation for the D-Day landings in Normandy. And women played important support roles alongside their male counterparts throughout the Cape's military apparatus. I'm going to share a couple of the stories we've been able to unpack here with you now. So a battalion of WACs served at Camp Edwards. The Camp Edwards newspaper has a lot of really interesting articles sort of in advance of their coming and then once they're actually there. And very excitingly, most of the articles are very positive and, sort of really try and emphasize to the folks reading this newspaper that, hey, these women are here to help us out and you should respect them and appreciate that they've come here to do this work versus, oh, gross, these women are here to take our jobs and send us off to sea. Because, we're a maritime museum and most of our research is really focused on some of the more maritime sides of these experiences, I unfortunately don't have a lot of really great individual stories about the women who served with the WAC at Camp Edwards, but if you know anyone who did or know of folks who might have that info, I would love to get more. It's definitely something in general we're always excited to try and get unpack a little bit more of this history together. Before we get into more of the sort of aquatic adjacent things, maritime adjacent things, I have one more story to share with you guys about women on the Cape during the war. And that is that we had WASPs flying in and out of Otis. What they were doing was ferrying planes throughout the war. Members of the WASP performed a number of important duties, one of which was training male pilots. They would tow targets for fighter pilots in training to practice firing their guns at a moving target in the sky. They also worked as test pilots for new aircraft. But one of the biggest and most important roles that they served was acting as a ferrying service, moving planes from base to base. So if you needed a plane flown across the country or up and down the coast, the likelihood is that a WASP was responsible for bringing it to you. The WASP wouldn't stay at the Cape for long. This wasn't a place where they trained or really did any sort of other like more long-term, we're going to be here for 6 months kind of work. But they did have their own dormitory on Otis Airfield. So when you flew your plane in, you could take a break at Otis, rest up for your next assignment, and you either hop into another plane and fly off to your next assignment, or you could hop in a car and drive down to wherever you needed to go, which is what the four women with the tree behind them were doing. They had successfully ferried their planes in and then went on a road trip to their next spot and took some really fun photos of the trip. Unfortunately, one of the most tragic incidents on the Cape during the war involves the WASP. Frances Grimes, pictured here underneath the plane, was a WASP who was killed on takeoff from Otis Field. Her A-24 dive bomber, which is the plane, this is not the exact plane, but it is the type of plane she was flying, experienced a stall and a spin, and she was killed in the resulting accident. Accidents like this were not uncommon for both men and women pilots during the war, as aircraft was often finicky or problematic even when right off the factory line. This is why I always joke with people where if I traveled back in time and was around during World War II, flying any kind of aircraft would have been very low on my list of jobs I would have wanted to do because it was extremely dangerous basically at all times. Unfortunately, despite the fact that both these, accidents were common for both men and women pilots at the time, women had a, sort of unique problem to worry about here. There's significant evidence that many WASPs were targeted by male pilots or instructors for sabotage. Several WASPs reported sugar had been dumped into their engines or their tires were slashed, and this was not always caught before a plane left the runway. Virtually none of these incidences were ever investigated thoroughly, as higher-ups believed that if word got out, it would endanger the whole program and create more obstacles for future female military pilots. I want to make it very clear that we have no evidence, and I am not at all suggesting that Frances died as a result of sabotage. But I think it's still something I really wanted to bring up here, as it's another sort of facet of this story that is sort of undertold and underreported. This is something in general that I feel like a lot of people don't always appreciate about the sacrifice that women were willing to make during the war. We kind of have this impression that because, the waves were mostly stateside, they weren't really, doing anything. They're not storming the beaches of Iwo Jima. This was, something that wasn't scary or anything like that. And I'm not trying to suggest that it was more dangerous than having an active combat role, but these women were still signing up for jobs where, accidents happened, you could get hurt, you could get killed, you could get really sick being exposed to, if you're in the Pacific with the Army Nurse Corps or you're, there with the WAC, you could get malaria, all sorts of stuff. So, Army nurses were killed in Axis bombings in Europe. A bunch of military nurses were taken prisoner during the fall of the Philippines. So this was not something where you're enlisting and you're 100% just going to have this really cushy, easy stateside job where you never have any problems besides annoying coworkers. Another aspect specifically for the WASP that is, sort of uniquely frustrating for this period is that, again, they were civilians. So despite the fact that Frances Grimes died doing work for the US military, they did not pay for her funeral, and her surviving family members would not get any benefits after her death. This was true for all 38 WASP killed in the line of duty during the war. So not really a great moment for the US military. But one of the biggest stories on the Cape of our sort of unique military history here is Unit 21, Chatham's Loran monitoring station. So this is further up the coast from Otis. Unit 21 was a Coast Guard Loran monitoring station in Chatham. Loran, short for Long Range Navigation, was a hyperbolic radio navigation system developed during the war. With Loran, difference in distance between 2 points is determined by measurement of the time interval between receipt of signals from transmitters at 2 points. It was one of the first almost real-time positioning systems, so really a predecessor to our GPS systems and stuff like that. And it can be used by a ship at sea without breaking radio silence. So this is a huge game changer for a war where you really need to worry about German submarines hearing where you are and sinking your ship. Standard Loran was originally developed for just use on ships, but was eventually used for airborne navigation during the war as well. Loran monitoring stations were originally run by male members of the Coast Guard, but as the war continued, it was decided that spars would be trained in Loran and rotated in. Excitingly, the official history of the spars published by the Coast Guard, immediately after the war, features a lengthy interview with the woman who took command at Unit 21. So we have a really great first-person narrative of what it was like to live and work there. Vera Hammerschlag was a New York native who came to the Cape specifically to work at this unit. And she remembered, quote, "In the summer of 1943, headquarters decided that the Loran monitor stations within continental United States should be manned by spars. The monitor station is equipped with the same type of receiver indicator, but being a fixed station is able to check the accuracy and general operations of the transmitting stations. The SPAR operators had to stand watch 24 hours a day, taking and recording these measurements every 2 minutes. Having worked as an assistant to the naval liaison operator for LORAN at the radiation lab and thereby becoming familiar with the LORAN system, I was selected to be in charge of the first SPAR monitor station at Chatham, Massachusetts. One enlisted SPAR and I were assigned to a 2-month course at MIT in LORAN operation and maintenance of receiving equipment. We were the only women in the whole LORAN section of the Naval Training School, and needless to say, caused comment. LORAN was so hush-hush that not even the training officer had any conception of what the duties of these SPARs would be, nor what their qualifications should be. I'm going to interrupt Vera here to quickly clarify. This does not mean that the trainer was like, I don't know how to train you on this or what to train you. It just meant that Vera couldn't tell him, oh, I'm going to be in charge of this monitoring station in Chatham, Massachusetts, and it's going to be all women run, and we're going to be doing all of this. The trainer adequately trained both of these women on what they were supposed to do there, but didn't know where they would ultimately end up or what they would really be doing with this information because it was so secretive. So back to Vera. The station consisted of one small building, pictured here, about 50 feet long and 30 feet wide. This provided sleeping quarters, recreation room, office space, operations room, repair shop, and storage space. I was operations and engineering officer, medical officer, barracks officer, personnel officer, training officer, and even captain of the head, the bathroom. I had to learn the intricacies of plumbing of a coal furnace, of a Kohler engine that supplied emergency power when the main line was out, and being on the Cape where nor'easters are frequent, the times were many. I remember the feeling I had when I looked up at the 125-foot mast for the station's antenna and wondered which spar would climb the rigging if something went wrong. I asked the CO whom I was replacing who took care of it. His nonchalant answer was not to worry, since nothing would happen to it short of a hurricane. Of course, as some of you may know, a major hurricane did hit the Cape in 1944, and the spars were evacuated in fear of the antenna falling on the building. So what we have here, as I already pointed out, is the photo of the station. This other photo, which is from our friends at the Chatham Historical Society, is from a Christmas card that the station sent out, which very excitingly identifies all of the members of the station. You might notice there is one guy there. Raymond Rathjen was one of the guys who was sort of left as the last person to make sure the sort of continuity of training was in there. And once he was confident that the women could handle it themselves, he shipped off to another station. But very excitingly, this is the first and only all-female run LORAN station in the country. So really cool moment in Coast Guard history, cool moment in women's history in general, and it happened right in our backyard, essentially. This is a better photo of Vera, and then one of her colleagues, Anita Freeman. LORAN, again, was top secret at the time. So the women at the station were given firearms training and issued weapons to protect the station in case anyone tried to break in and steal any information. So Anita Freeman, who's a radio man, featured here with the 3 guns, remembered that she was the worst shot in the group. One of their other colleagues, Marion Simmons, remembered one particularly alarming night at the station, quote, "The monitor room was locked at all times. One night we heard a noise in the entry area and called out asking the person to identify him or herself. There was no answer, so we armed ourselves. I was shaking. Could I really shoot someone? No shots were fired, as we determined the intruder was the CO's dog." So scary night, but ultimately all ends well. Right nearby the monitoring station was another really cool opportunity for women in the military on Cape. Also happening in Chatham, the hub of all of our excitement. The US Navy took control of the Chatham RCA radio station from 1942 through 1945 as the East Coast primary intercept station. It intercepted all encrypted messages between German High Command and their Atlantic Fleet. From Chatham, these messages would then be passed on to Washington, D.C., where they would be decrypted, also often by waves on machines like this one. Chatham was also the control station for the Navy's U-boat direction finding network. Anytime a U-boat transmission was detected, the network immediately moved to locate the sub's position. At the station, about 60 radio and 3 teletype operators worked 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, listening for enemy messages. Much like the work at Unit 21, the work here was top secret and couldn't be discussed with anyone. And in June of 1944, the first group of WAVs arrived at the station to start rotating out the men to serve in other positions. Unlike Unit 21, which became all women run, the WAVs here worked alongside Navy men as radio and teletype operators, as well as in additional support positions. As Chatham was one important piece of a bigger pie, the operators who were taking these messages were not generally aware of the full meaning of the messages they were sending on to Washington. But there were a few subtle ways they could kind of understand the real importance of the work they were doing there and the success of the work they were doing there. Commander John Knight, who ran the Chatham station, told those working there, "You may never know the outcome of your work. However, it really is working, and the U-boats are disappearing fast." U-boats were of particular concern to people of the Cape. Many residents still living on the Cape would absolutely remember the U-boat attack on Orleans during World War I, and their World War II ancestors, cousins, etc., were deadly threats to anyone on the water. Several ships were torpedoed and sunk off Cape by these submarines, but after codebreakers in the UK cracked the Enigma machine's code, the Allies were able to make pretty short work of them. This was a huge game changer in the course of the war, and part of why the work in Chatham was so secretive. The Germans actually remained completely oblivious to the fact that Enigma had been broken until well after the war's end. So top secret, managed to keep it under wraps. Great job, guys. Total, about 135 WAVs served at the Chatham station. While their time on the Cape was pretty brief, for many of the WAVs and SPARs, this experience was life-changing even beyond doing important and unusual work for the war effort. Our friends at the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center have identified a number of WAVs who married Navy men they worked with, and some of them or their children have come back to the Cape to see where their parents first met and get to visit the place where their parents worked, which is pretty cool. Radio man Marion Simmons, one of the SPARs at Unit 21, remembered, "The esprit de corps of Unit 21 was outstanding. We were a family unit. I remember the church wedding we had for one of our members. Wearing my uniform, I married Ray Simmons on May 6, 1944 at the Methodist Church, and all the townspeople turned out for it. My CO, Vera, gave me away. After our reception at the New Yorker restaurant, we honeymooned in Boston, and a few days later, I was back to work at Unit 21. Anita Freeman, the one I just showed you a photo of holding the 3 pistols, also met her spouse on the Cape. The Detroit native fell in love with Sully Eldridge, and together they raised their family in Chatham. Anita worked at Ron McVicker's sandwich shop on Chatham's Main Street later in life, which eventually evolved into Sandy's Diner, named after Anita's daughter, who ran the place until around 2019. So pretty cool, life-changing opportunity beyond just doing a really interesting job, right? So, all right, the war is over. What do we do now? The WAC, WAVs, SPARs, and U.S. Marines Women's Reserve all faced the same challenge at the war's end. What now? The only reason the WASP didn't was because the unit had been disbanded completely at the end of 1944. Most women had enlisted for the duration of the war plus 6 months, as I had said earlier. Now that time had come, women who wanted to continue serving in the military were sort of in a weird spot, a tough spot, really. While women in all branches were across the board praised effusively for their hard work and dedication during the war and the results of that work, now that it was over, men were expected to come home and take back stateside positions. That left there was no room left for the WAVs, WACs, or SPARs. Women who might have wanted to stay were eventually pushed out of their jobs. This is also a period where, in general, because the war is over, the military is going to kind of shrink back down to a more peacetime size. So even if it was a situation where we'd like to keep you, there are just less roles available, and this is 1945, the men are going to get priority. One of the most interesting ways we can see this sort of shift in hey, join the military, it's the right thing to do, you're being a great, contribution to society to do that, and then get out, we want the men back, comes in period advertisements from this era. Some of my favorites are these 2 from Camel cigarettes during the war, and then Schlitz beer from the post-war period. In general, Schlitz, I'm always butchering the pronunciation. has a lot of sort of sexist ads showing women in these much more sort of like, I'm preparing dinner, getting you a beer, working while, you know, I've been working hard all day, and, you know, I'm now kind of your servant. But during the war, a lot of these advertisements that were, you know, showing military women or women in general really emphasized the work that they were doing. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but each of these little descriptions of the different groups really says, like, you know, while you're doing these sort of important jobs, like driving this truck, decoding these messages, you should be smoking our really awesome cigarettes. But it's like, you know, it goes beyond just you should be smoking these really awesome cigarettes. It's like these women are doing important jobs, and this is sort of, you know, normal, and you should be excited about it. And this ad is geared towards you, a woman in the military. And then after the war, you get stuff where it's like you should be back at home making dinner for people. So this is just, again, sort of reflective of the bigger societal change where it's, you know, the war's over, we want to return to normalcy, and that means women need to be back at home raising children, supporting your husband in his civilian or military job, rather than pursuing any kind of career of your own. You see the same kind of stuff about like women who worked as, you know, Rosie the Riveter types, or really any kind of stuff. The immediate post-war period is very women back in the home at all costs. The other thing is, with the war over and no legislation allowing women to continue serving in the military, in peacetime, no new recruits could come in. So as people's enlistments expired, duration of the war plus 6 months, there's no way to get new people into the organization. There are also no civilian institutions or much help from the military specifically for women veterans. They could use the GI Bill and got benefits for being, you know, an enlisted member of the military, but there wasn't anything that was really geared towards how do you kind of readjust to civilian life? How do you, you know, what are you going to do with these new skills that you've had? And with the slander campaign against the WAC, which, you know, did affect other military women as well and their reputation and sort of public perception towards them. While that was all fear and rumor mongering, it still left a lasting impression on other people's attitudes towards women in uniform. And unfortunately, this meant that some women really didn't even want to be considered a veteran in fear that assumptions could be made about their character if they kind of advertised that in the post-war period. But as we know, things began to change for women looking to serve their country in the military fairly shortly after the end of the war, fortunately. Still a long fight, but, you know, progress is progress. In 1948, Harry Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which allowed women to become permanent regular members of the U.S. Armed Forces in the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and the recently formed Air Force. Women were still forbidden from serving or operating Air Force and Navy vessels and aircraft that might engage in combat, but this was a huge step forward for, you know, women who were looking to continue serving their country in this way. The SPARs were reestablished in 1949, allowing women back into the Coast Guard. Kind of in this period, you do actually get some people who served during the war who came back into leadership positions in these organizations. A bunch of early women officers in the Air Force were former WASP. You had some folks from the Coast Guard who were SPARs who came back, stuff like that. So it wasn't just a situation where, oh, I was only doing this job because it was the war, and, you know, some people really liked this work and wanted to continue it, and this really shows that that is, you know, something they wanted to continue pursuing. Meanwhile, the WASPs were still not considered military at all. So while a former SPAR could apply for veterans benefits or benefit from the GI Bill, WASPs were excluded from all of this. And despite working for the military and serving in the same roles as male pilots in the Army Air Forces, they received no veterans benefits at all. The civilian world wasn't any kinder to women pilots. Commercial airlines turned down former WASP pilots because the public wouldn't stand for it. After the formation of the U.S. Air Force, as I said, several members of the WASP were offered commissions, but all 121 who accepted were assigned desk duty and were barred from flying. Members of their organization continued to fight for military status and recognition, but were hindered by their work being classified for 35 years and general sexism. So, you know, it doesn't help to try and lobby for these things when you don't have sort of the active proof of this is what we did during the war until it becomes declassified. It wasn't until President Jimmy Carter signed the GI Bill Improvement Act of 1977 that service as a WASP would be considered active duty for the purposes of programs run by like the VA. But as we know, you know, the military has pretty much, there's not to make it sound like the military is a perfect angel when it comes to, you know, gender relations or anything like that, but these women really were groundbreaking in terms of changing ideas of what a woman could do for the military, which really, broke boundaries for all the women who came after them. And without all these women who, volunteered their time by enlisting in the military to serve their country during World War II, could be a different world that we would be living in today. And the Cape played a fairly important and significant role in that. So again, it's kind of a preview of what we're looking at for at least one chapter of our women's history exhibit. We've got a lot of other women we were very excited to introduce you all to, or hopefully reintroduce you to if you've encountered them before. And I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
That was really wonderful, Emily. Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. So there is something, everybody, please feel free to sound off in the Q&A function if you have any questions for Emily. In the meantime, I have a question for you. You had mentioned when we were talking about fashion and how much fashion really influenced the uniforms, you had mentioned that there was a little bit of a kerfuffle, especially with the WAC uniform. And how the uniform, how style at that point was very sort of militaristic in terms of clothing choice. Can you get into that and that kerfuffle?
So basically what ended up happening is, as you guys might remember, the WAC was sort of the first of the new women's organizations that cropped up in this period. And because of that, they kind of didn't anticipate, oh, we maybe should make some rules about who can and can't produce stuff that looks like a WAC uniform. So a bunch of civilian clothing organizations made stuff that looked pretty much exactly like what the WAC would be wearing, like jackets, hats, skirts, etc., and just sold as fashion pieces that, you or I, a civilian, could walk into a department store and buy. And then when I, perhaps someone who is not trained in military, conduct, or someone who is perhaps of a shady character, decides to wear that uniform out and about and is getting publicly drunk or soliciting people for sex or other stuff, it makes it look like members of the WAC are doing that, which makes the Army go, oh, oops, probably should have shut that down and been like, you're not allowed to do that, because it creates this kind of confusing atmosphere that really fed into that slander campaign, because you have people saying stuff like, well, I saw this woman at this bar, start a fight with, and it's like, she was a factory worker, she's not a WAC. And she wasn't with other WACs, she's not at all related to us, but appearances wise, it looks pretty bad for the Army. Another factor was, I think it was actually officially Army produced women's uniforms that were basically identical to the WAC that they shipped to North Africa to give to French civilian women who were apparently not up to the US standards of behavior. And it again led to this sort of confusion of the WAC are these promiscuous, rude, violent people, and in reality it's no, these are not American women who are serving with the US Army. They're completely unrelated to us. They just have basically our Army surplus. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm pretty sure they then sort of, when they made the uniforms for the SPARs and the WAVs and the women Marines, they were like, okay, we really need to start making some kind of limitations on who is allowed to produce clothing that looks similar to this, to kind of avoid that happening to them as well, which is also kind of why some of the slander campaign it still, again, as I said, it still affected people's attitudes towards women in uniform in general, but it was more geared towards the WAC than the other branches, because they were the ones who kind of, unfortunately, as the front runners, had a lot of the kinks needed to be worked out for the other services after they kind of came in, and they just don't have the same thing of a woman wandering around in a WAVs uniform starting bar fights. So
a little bit of the growing pains on their end, I'd say. Can you talk a little bit about the roles that the WACs, what I found really interesting, the reason why I'm asking this question, I found it really interesting that the WACs did the most sort of global travel with, they didn't always stay stateside. Can you talk about a little bit about what they would have done? Would they have been repairing, Army materials like tanks, jeeps?
It's pretty much anything they did stateside, they would also do in the field in either theater. So, you would have folks working to do mechanical repairs on stuff. But one of the biggest roles that one of the most sort of publicized roles that they really played was doing a lot of the mail service. That was actually one of the photos I included was of one of the battalions of all Black WACs who were a postal battalion. And so it's really, involved, and as someone who used to work for the Postal Inspection Service, who has a greater appreciation for how our mail gets to and from different places, I think that's a really great and like really interesting underappreciated story of like people kind of don't think about what does it mean to have to transport all of this mail back and forth during wartime, and how do we get it to people on the front lines quickly enough so that you can get important news from home, get important news from you back to your loved ones, all that sort of stuff. And really it's the WAC who, you know, not solely, there were men who helped out in this way as well, but you know, a lot of the postal battalions were manned by women, so you know, they were the ones who were really making sure that people had that really important, you know, taste of home getting to them. But essentially, it's most of the same stuff. A lot of the WAC would have been more in like the UK, and then eventually sort of France and other areas that were really like active fighting is over here. We're moving them in so that they can do stuff, you know, without having to worry about, you know, something like the Battle of the Bulge happening with, you know, Germans breaking through the line and taking everybody captive. But that was really, you know, it's essentially, it's not super different from what you would be doing stateside necessarily, but it's still pretty cool because you get to do it when you're in France.
All right. Okay, and does anybody have any questions? The Q&A right now is empty, so please feel free to sound off. We've got a comment from Ruth. She says, thank you, very nice, very interesting.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Can you tell me a little bit about, in your research for this and for our women's exhibit that we have coming up, what has been, you know, the favorite thing that, your favorite thing that you've come across to do with today's topic? I mean, you did talk a little bit about Vera, and I've seen you.
Vera is the favorite. Like, Vera is definitely the favorite, both because she, like, post-war lived a pretty interesting life. She actually moved out west and, you know, was like, I think she married a guy who like owned a ranch, and they helped finance a local theater and all sorts of stuff. So she's just a really interesting woman. I'm always a little bit bummed with stuff like this, where, you know, it can be really tough if you don't have someone like a Charity Adams, the CEO of the Postal Battalion I was just talking about, who, you know, wrote a memoir and stayed in the Army, and like people have written tons and tons of books about her. When it's something a little more kind of local and, you know, secretive, like the work at the Lawrence station was, you know, we're really lucky that we have anything about the women that worked there, because they intentionally are not trying to leave much of a physical trace of their presence. And we really lucked out that Vera got interviewed for this Coast Guard history, and we have that, you know, with her, because I think if I'm remembering correctly, she may have passed in like somewhere between 90 and 98. So, you know, we don't have tons and tons of oral histories about her. She didn't write a memoir. The 90s is sort of a weird period, not like a weird period, but an interesting period in World War II history, because it's a little bit, a lot of the big push that we have now for like, oh, we really need to get grandpa to write a memoir or, you know, do an oral history or whatever, kind of came post Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, because people kind of realized like, oh, my grandfather or my dad has these stories. We should really talk to them about this. So when you had people who passed away kind of before that threshold, we really have lost a lot of really great first person sources. So it was really exciting to find out like, oh, we have, you know, this interview. Chatham has that great postcard where everybody is identified. Like that is just a historian's dream to have that kind of stuff. But the other one I think is really the fact that we had members of the WASP here at all. They were definitely something when I first got into World War II history as a kid that I thought this is such a cool story that, you know, I literally only learned about it because there is an American Girl book about it. Like it was not ever discussed in my classes. It's not something that like, you know, now they've gotten a lot more attention where like you can go to the Smithsonian's exhibit about Americans at war and there will be stuff about the WASP there. But because it was classified for so long, and because women's history wasn't always historically something people were really interested in on a very public level, it's also something where it's very underreported, and it's something where you kind of don't think about like, oh yeah, like we have an Air Force base here. You have to have someone flying these planes in and out. It would have been members of the WASP, and they had their own dormitory, and, you know, they got to, you know, on their way back, driving to their next stop, got to like, you know, sightsee a little bit and stuff. And that's one of the things I think is very cool about some of the stories we've been able to pluck out too, is you occasionally get references to people being like, we loved being on the Cape because like we befriended a bunch of local lobstermen who would give us lobsters for free at the end of the day. And it's like, you know, the war is a horrible, awful thing, but you sometimes get these really fun, interesting, just human interest pieces of like, I had never been to this part of the country. I had never, you know, thought about living here or what it would be like or anything. And then you meet your husband and spend your entire life living in Chatham, working at a restaurant that is a, staple of Main Street for decades. Like, it's all very like fun that we were able to actually get this much information out of something that is a really niche topic. And again, something that historically had gone kind of under-reported, basically.
Something that amazed me too, and I've known this for a little while since you've been doing your research. We've been talking a lot in the office, but something that absolutely amazed me about the WASPs is that they would tow these targets for fighter pilots to, fire on and to shoot at and to practice with, and that blew my mind. That the sheer danger that something like that.
I'm pretty sure you would work your way up to actually using live rounds. So hopefully you've got someone who kind of knows what they're doing behind you at some point. But I think if I'm remembering correctly, there were a few instances of like planes getting pretty shot up and stuff of like,
Right.
This is really dangerous work.
Right. I mean, they would do that. They would do that in the Navy with their men as well. They would tow their aircraft with sort of like a towing sleeve that would be towed very far behind, but still.
You get someone who's not a great shot and you're going to hit the plane. And I think one of the things also that I didn't really get into super detail with is like we do actually have I was just, as you know, I was just at the World War II Museum at the end of the year, and they have a great oral history with a WASP who has this really like awful encounter she had with one of her COs who was a man in the Army who essentially was like, she was like, hey, I have concerns about the stability of the plane you're asking me to fly. Like, I think there's some mechanical issues that really need to be checked out before I leave. And he's like, we don't have time for that. And frankly, I don't care because you're expendable. And that was really the attitude that a lot of these people had, was that it's like, you're a civilian and you're a woman, so I don't care if you get killed. But I'm not sending a man in this plane because we need him to, shoot up, Japanese Zeros in the Pacific. And, how awful that is to be like, I'm risking my life for my country. And I'm being treated like this because I'm a woman, and God forbid I die. I'm not getting, any compensation to my family. You're not going to pay for my funeral. Actually, one of the women I featured in my slide, Hazel Ying Lee, one of the two Chinese American pilots who flew with the WASP, she died in an accident, and government didn't pay for anything. Family didn't get any benefits. And her brother, I think, was in Europe, but he was with a tank battalion and was killed as well. Their parents, while trying to figure out, they're from Oregon, I think they were from Salem, while trying to find a place to bury their kids, were basically told, you're not allowed to be buried, you can't bury them in the cemetery because it's only for white people. And it's like, can you just imagine, like, you've lost both of your children in the service of their country. One of them is being treated like completely differently than her sibling because of her gender. And now your community is saying, we don't want to honor literally, people who gave their lives for our country because you're not white. And it's just, it's a very frustrating. Again, it's World War II really has it all. You have the fun lobster story, and then you have the like, oh wow, this is some of the worst looks in American history. Mm-hmm. There are plenty of those throughout time, but yeah.
And it wasn't until 1948 that the military was desegregated, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that was another Harry Truman policy, and it was, so Korea is the first war where you had integrated units. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't think there's any more questions. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you guys for spending your Sunday with me.
Thank you for spending your Sunday with us. So the next lecture that we have coming up is on April 16th, and it is Reading the Glass. It's a captain's view of weather, water, and life on ships. And this is going to be with Captain Elliot Rappaport, who's from Maine Maritime Academy. I was going to say Maine Maritime Museum, but no, he's Maine Maritime Academy. And he will be talking all about that. In the meantime, folks, please feel free to visit our website. We are temporarily switching from one provider to the next. We've upgraded our website experience. And in the meantime, while that is happening, while we're sort of tinkering with it, please feel free to visit our website, capecodmaritimemuseum.com, C-O-M, for the next couple days until that website switches over. You'll get a preview of that sort of redesigned experience. It's really, really cool looking. You can sign up for our other lectures and programs that we have coming up. And I also want to remind everybody that April is Earth Month for Cape Cod Maritime Museum. Of course, we have Earth Day on April 20th. And with that, we are going to be doing a few beach cleanup days. You can sign up, it's completely free. You can come join us at Calmus or Veterans Beach. Those are going to be April 8th and April 15th. Those are both Saturdays. We're going to be walking the beach, cleaning them up, and hopefully leaving less of a presence than there was before, and making sure that Mother Earth and our beaches are as beautiful as we can possibly keep them. And again, it's free, so if you're in town, feel free to join us on that April 8th and April 15th. And then on April 22nd, which is another Saturday, we will be doing a craft activity with the beach debris and beach trash that we've found. So hope you guys can all join us. They're all free. Again, go to our website, capecodmaritimemuseum.com for now, for the next couple days, while the website switches over to sign up for any of those programs. And Emily, thank you so much again. I'll see you in a couple, less than 24 hours. All right, thanks, folks. Take care. Have a good afternoon.